Okay, everyone. Good. We are going to now continue. Okay, we're going to continue now our discussion of satire, Swift, and the Augustan age. The previous recording that I produced for class focused on right thinking and satire, and what Swift, as a disciple of John Dryden and a person of the Enlightenment of the early 18th century, was attempting to do with satire as an exercise in intelligent thought, independent thinking, realizing that the work is kind of a mirror of you. There's another element to that, and that was the first thing. I want to talk also about the role, place of writing, of literature, poetry, and other forms. We're starting to read, obviously, a great deal more prose, but what role literature plays in the culture. In the Renaissance, literature was, like everything, art, politics, proto-science. It doesn't really exist in the Renaissance, but to the extent that it does, an instrument of religion. As proper thinking, taste develops, philosophy, politics will slowly occupy that space culturally. Of course, there still is an emphasis on proper belief as well. But what is literature in all of this? And I just want you to remember that reading is probably the revolutionary activity of the Reformation. It's what creates all that strife during the late Renaissance. Reading the Bible on one's own, reading the Bible, returning to the text, the King James Bible, and so on. So reading is crucial. This literacy is expanding. That is a story that accompanies us throughout our travels in here, the 18th and into the 19th century. Growing literacy, people able both to actually read, get a hold of text, and also have the kind of intelligence to make sense of all of it. There is a new place for the works of literature. Literature first become less aspects, less tools of religious theological debate. They become first ways to think about the world clearly. That's what Joseph Addison is advocating. They also become ways to enjoy the world. They are less places to make truth claims, as Professor Kohlbrenner said in one of the recordings, and rather a way to think about truth. Kind of a gym or an exercise, or a way to develop, to cultivate proper thought about the world. A modest proposal does that to a certain extent, but it is done to a far greater degree in the other great satire produced by Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver's Travels is a text that you will come back to. Well, some of you will come back to in the next semester, in the restoration course with Professor Shapira. Professor Shapira is teaching a class that some of you are in. I know not all of you, in which you will have a chance to read. Gulliver's Travels in somewhat greater detail. You'll be reading Professor Shapira's syllabus with book 4. Sorry, I just got an important email. The text is a crucial one in development of literary history and development of the novel. And that's why I'm just mentioning it to all of you, although of course I know not everyone is in Dr. Shapira's class. Gulliver's Travels is a text from 1726. It can be said to be a kind of early novel. We're going to talk a lot. I'm not interested not interested in labels in general, but certainly not at this point. We'll be talking about the rise of the novel in about 2 weeks. It is a fantasy text. It is a text of travel. We'll talk also about that. I'm discussing it now out of order, out of chronological order of a predecessor to it, which is Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, which actually was published 7 years prior to Gulliver's Travels. But here we're talking about Jonathan Swift and satire, so it makes sense to talk about it at this time. 1719, Daniel Defoe, Robinson Crusoe. That's later this week and into next week, our major reading for this course. Right now, a little taste of Gulliver's Travels. Let's look at the frontispiece of this travel text, a work of great imagination, and also a biting satire, and likewise a landmark in literature, in what literature stands for. So let's spend a few minutes on this text. Where are we? We are here in this Augustan age Swift. Let's open the frontispiece. I already have it open here. But if you click here on Gulliver's Travels, these three links, that's what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes as an overview of this text. Let me pin this here. Okay. This is from the first edition, the frontispiece. Travels into several remote lands of the world in 4 parts by Lemuel Gulliver, first a surgeon, then a captain of several ships. This is volume 1, printed in Fleet Street in 1500, 11. Those are each hundreds, so 1,500 and 200s is 17, XX 20, 5, 6, 1726. This is not Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift was a bit more homely looking. This is, as it says, Captain Lemuel Gulliver, the so-called author of this text. Authorship, a major idea that will develop. There is no notion of these works being written by people like Jonathan Swift or Daniel Defoe. It would be the same issue in Robinson Crusoe. What else do we see of this? It doesn't label itself in any genre. It's not describing itself as a work of imaginative fiction. It doesn't say that it's a novel or a travelogue or made up. In fact, it says that it is travels into several remote regions of the world. It is a work of travel literature, a travelogue, for which there was enormous demand in these decades of the early 18th century, as there would be as there would be in any period when there was enormous great discovery of new parts of the world, remote regions. This is a period when the merchant marine and the navies of the European powers were extending their reach, and travel was not was not widely available. There's no sense of tourism, but people who had to do this as their profession, either on behalf of the Navy, on behalf of the Crown, or for trade. This is a new pursuit, and people, almost all of whom were bound at home. I guess we are in a new way bound at home, but the people who did not leave their villages and towns in London have a window into the world thanks to this new kind of writing, again, for which there was enormous demand. Robinson Crusoe will be the same. Lemuel Gulliver, first a doctor, a person who is a surgeon, someone of the mind, but not of enormous intelligence, set out in a series of 4 separate voyages. And the first one takes him to the land of the Lilliputs, these small microscopic people, only about a few inches tall, who engage in all kinds of small disputes. I see, because I have to hurry a little bit, I'll just instead of looking at some of the phrases within, I'll just describe it. It's the first part. It's the 4th part that is probably the most influential, and I'll describe in a second. The first voyage, the land of the Lilliputtans, where Gulliver washes up as a shipwreck, something we'll return to again. The ship crashes, it is wrecked, and he is a survivor, sole survivor in this place of these tiny little creatures who have these tiny little disputes, all kinds of debates, sometimes quite violent, over tiny trivial differences. What does that remind us of? Well, any number of things. Perhaps the small differences of politics. This is someone who was writing in the decade after Civil War, or the small religious disputes of the decade before, of the century before. So perhaps there is a way of mirroring back what has happened, what the human experience or the cultural British experience had been through writing. It is not making obvious claims. Again, there's the wit and satire, but it does seem to be a reflection of British culture. That becomes even more obvious in the fourth and final section of the book, one that is probably the most widely read. That is the book for the travel to the land of the Houyhnhnms. Houyhnhnms has a very complicated spelling. It is a section in which Gulliver, in his most violent shipwreck, he actually suffers a mutiny. Is his crew becomes a captain. His crew rebels against him, and they send him overboard. He's sent to this land of enlightened horses who live as sort of philosophers and live this incredibly advanced society in which the underclass, the servants, are these malformed, almost monstrous versions of people called yahoos. And Gulliver starts identifying, he starts conversing with the Houyhnhnms, these horse philosophers, these enlightened beings, and slowly loses his identification with yahoos and almost becomes aghast, horrified at his yahoo nature. He seems to resemble these yahoos, who are, of course, humans. That is a work of more direct satire, making fun of the human condition and our absurdity, our inability, our refusal to exercise proper judgment. In the last section I want to share with you, the introduction or the preface to this work, Gulliver, not Isaac Swift, but Gulliver sends a letter to his cousin Simpson. It says that this is in the year 1727. It's in a second edition of the book. Gulliver says, I hope, and he calls his cousin Simpson, who was the printer of this travelogue, calls him to account. He rebukes his cousin Simpson. I hope you'll be ready to own publicly whenever you shall be called that by your great and frequent urgency you prevailed on me to publish very loose and incorrect account of my travels. You pushed me, you pressured me into writing an inaccurate version of my travels. In order to hire some young gentlemen, you put them in a correct style as my comment. You asked me to hire an editor who could publish this. After all, Gulliver was just a simple man of the merchant marine. But I do not remember that I gave you power, that anything should be omitted. You changed what I wrote, and much anything should be inserted. Therefore, I renounce anything of the kind, particularly a paragraph about the Queen. This has gotten him in trouble, whom I do revere and esteem more than any of the human species. Swift, you may remember, I said briefly, had major differences with the Queen. That's actually why he didn't become a bishop in England. You or your interpolator, whoever did this editing work for you, ought to have considered that it was not my inclination, so it was not decent to praise any animal of our composition before my master Houyhnhnm. I didn't mean to praise anyone above these enlightened horses, the Houyhnhnms, and that was being false. In fact, I still hold my allegiance to these and my reverence, my respect to my master Houyhnhnm, the king of the horses. You have either omitted some material circumstance, you changed what again. So here is Swift in the voice of Gulliver, disavowing the work for not actually reflecting what he meant to say, cloaking himself. So again, this is both very amusing. It's fun to read this. We know that Gulliver doesn't really, well, we know that Gulliver, people in that time, unless they were part of the more sophisticated class of readers, would not have understood this. And also, he is disavowing any of the yahoos which are now said to govern, especially at a time when I fear the unhappiness. Have not I the most recent to complain when I see these very yahoos or Wyndhams in a vehicle. He's saying, I've come now back to England. And I see these yahoos, these horrible people that he had seen on that island, the land of the Wyndhams. They seem to be in charge here in England. And the Wyndhams seem to be pulling the vehicles, pulling the coaches. Those rational creatures are reduced to slavery, and the enlightened being and these horrible creatures, the yahoos he sees everywhere. He starts identifying these inventions. He invents yahoos. That is a work of Swift, and he sees them all around. The yahoos don't seem to be able to exercise they don't seem to be subject to reformation. I have not seen, I told you, I didn't want this book published till virtue, honor, truth, good sense, courts that will become enlightened the way that the horse Wyndham culture is. He's identifying this imagined being, the yahoos, as being all around, as being real creatures. Here was a blurring of reality with fiction, a step, crucial on the path towards creating literary fiction. And he's using it to hold up a mirror to the country in which he lives. Why can't we be like those Wyndhams? He is doing it by amusing himself. It's fun for him to write this kind of fantastical work. And he's also using it as a work of serious morality. It is morality tempered by wit and entertainment. We'll talk more about this together, but those are the key ideas. And I'm going to stop the recording, post this for all of you, and we will talk about it together in a few minutes.